Anyway, so this was something I didn't get around to talking about, but again, I love SJW tweets and how they become full-fledged articles now. But yeah, some SJW was like, the death toll in Haiti is from Hurricane Matthew is 339. This is what environmental racism looks like. Hashtag Black Lives Matter.
I would call it a racist fart. Right? Because you do have racism and the wind comes and does the racist damage.
So are you saying that the divine wind that protected Japan from the Mongol invasion was racist against Mongols?
Now, I know you meant that as a joke, but I have something to show you. There are indeed people out there that believe pretty much exactly that. And make no mistake, I'm having trouble not finding a connection between the fact that divine law is Ma'at and Hurricane Matthew is the one that they're talking about now. Now, obviously, I'm joking. However, I am something of a conspiracy connoisseur. It's what I have formed a fandom around. Some people have comic books or video games, or I have conspiracies. I think that they are by far one of the most amusing things on the planet. As it were, I took my name from a book called the Illuminatus Trilogy that opens like this.
The history of the world is the history of the warfare between secret societies. Ishmael Reed, Mumbo Jumbo.
So know that I love a good conspiracy as much as the next man. But I'm gonna warn you, Sargon, you're closer with this analogy than with the weather control one.
Man, the power of the white people, right? We can now conjure hurricanes and deadly storms. You
say that, but I think that might actually be something that's happening.
The hurricane?
Kind of. Hang on. Just waiting for something to load.
Is it going to be like Red Alert? You know, it's like weather control device detected.
Yes.
The KKK are manning it.
Well, yeah. I mean, that's literally what the SJWs will think when this is something that becomes common knowledge.
Because while there are some that believe in weather control, I find this one far more entertaining. I think probably the harm believers are tier 1 conspiracy. I like the people that believe that spirituality is causing these hurricanes to further devastate these regions. And this is something that I call a perennial myth, or a perennial conspiracy. Like JFK or Martin Luther King, there's always going to be some form of conversation around this. I don't know why, but until the divides within our societies are settled, there's going to be some accusations of what they're calling now environmental racism. But back in 2005, I feel people were being a bit more honest about things. So, Sargon, you ready to drop all that white supremacist science mumbo-jumbo and hop on board, get woke, and decalcify that pineal gland, fam? 'Cause that's the goal of this video. These are the Asada Shakur forums, and they are indeed run by the Uhuru movement, so brace. Supposedly, this was originally written by a Kevin Carter of the Sacramento Observer in 2005. This is just after Hurricane Katrina, so, you know, the last time this happened. Hence, I call these perennial myths, because every time a situation occurs that is similar, these same things seem to trickle up in these same spheres. African American culture is rich in storytelling. Many values that shape black belief systems and black perspectives on life have origins in folklore, rural, and urban mythologies. In the wake of Hurricane Katrina, the most devastating storm to ever hit American soil, one such urban myth has been circulating throughout the black community. This myth stems from both folkloric and spiritual traditions. I do like how they say this, as though it granted some form of validity to the situation. It's not strictly relevant that your weird belief systems are based on your traditions. it still makes you a lunatic and very, very wrong. Just because they're black and it comes from black folklore doesn't excuse the level of wrongness involved. You must know that, right? It hinges on the notion that the suffering of black Americans will one day be avenged by a crushing act from an all-powerful being. Have you ever been in the path of a hurricane? Asked Daniel Buford, a lecturer and historian during a workshop on undoing racism. Hurricanes follow the path of slave ships, he said. Buford is a regional coordinator of the People's Institute West, an institute committed to teaching and organizing skills in the context of undoing racism, learning from history, sharing culture, leadership development, accountability, networking, internalized racial oppression, and internalized racial superiority. So basically what this boils down to is it's essentially an ad for the People's Institute West, huh? Alright, fair enough. Though Buford prefaced his comments as part of his own spiritual beliefs, in the wake of Hurricane Katrina, the analogy of the path of hurricanes and the voyage of slave vessels has stirred up a great deal of dialogue in black communities. It shouldn't have. That's a bad thing, not a good thing. Few, if any, from the black community are ready to contend that Hurricane Katrina was that crushing blow of vengeance for the suffering of black Americans, but the analogy serves as a reminder of the death and the anguish blacks have experienced historically in the Americas. Yes, of course, Hurricane Katrina reminded black people of slavery, because there's not a thing on the planet that doesn't. There is a historical indifference to the pain of poor people and black people in this country. Of course, always conflate the two, because it's not like it is actually the social economic side. No, it's always the black people and poor people, said the Reverend Jesse Jackson at a press conference in Baton Rouge last week. I think the premise is true, that hurricanes do mystically follow the path of slave ships, but it's hard to accept that this is some kind of curse when so many black families is bearing the brunt of the disaster, said David Saffel, a technician with Comcast Cable and a student of black history. Yes, I'm certain that those credentials are very important to everyone involved. Whether Hurricane Katrina will gain a place in black folklore, only time will tell. It did. However, it is true that the path of hurricanes in many instances have followed the course of the slave ships during the transatlantic slave. Why would you promote this kind of garbage in even a citywide newspaper like Sacramento Observer, like supposedly this is from? Why would you promote this level of crap? The W.E.B. Du Bois Institute reports that over the span of 400 years, more than 27,000 voyages were made by slave vessels from the west coast to Africa. Nah, dog, man, I tell you, we was always here. We's Native Americans, okay? That whole show me a slave ship, though. If there was slave ships, show me a slave ship, though. Exactly. It's difficult to get the exact count of the number of Africans that are among the ship's cargo, quote unquote. Yet the Institute was able to track at least 27,000 voyages. Most ships contain between 300 and 500 slaves. Again, irrelevant. Has absolutely nothing to do with the actual premise of the article, aside from it allows them to talk about slave ships, which is kind of amusing in its own right. The conditions of the slaves on board were intolerable. They were packed in the bows of the slave ships like sardines, chained and bound. It was a common practice for the crews to throw overboard slaves that had become sick and could not afford a net profit once the ships reached their destination in the Americas. Wasn't that common. This is another myth perpetuated, but okay. Sometimes whole cargoes were thrown overboard so the ship's commanders could collect insurance on the lost cargo. It's also hard to calculate the number of Africans that were thrown overboard. Some historians estimate that it's as many as 10 million Africans were thrown into the waters of the Atlantic during the transatlantic slave trade. Mind you, this is actually very important, as we'll see in a little bit of a later date here, or at a little bit of a later time. They actually believe that part of the reason why these are spiritually fueled is that the bones weren't allowed to dry. I couldn't make that up because I'm not a crazy person. Many of the ships carrying the cargo of black slaves have followed the same path of hurricanes today. Yeah, fundamentally untrue, as someone notes below, ironically. They set sail off the shores of West Africa and headed west, often passing the Caribbean islands. Sometimes slave ships docked in Cuba to unload cargo, and many times they sailed north through the waters of Gulf of Mexico and docked in New Orleans. At the time of the Civil War, New Orleans was the largest city in the South and was part of the American Confederacy and a major player in the transatlantic slave. It's also true that it was the highest population of slave-owning black people, freed blacks that lived in New Orleans, that had the highest percentile slave ownership of all. But of course we can't discuss that, can we? Hurricane Katrina seemed to follow a historical path of black oppression, the transatlantic slave trade, adjustment to bondage, Jim Crow, and segregation. Just splurge it all out there and relate it to a hurricane somehow. The hurricane first slammed into the shores of Florida, a state where many blacks were denied the right to vote in the 2000 elections. Yeah, they were denied that right because of a law passed by Bill Clinton, but whatever. It crashed upon the shores of New Orleans, a city where nearly 30% of its citizenry live below the poverty line, and a disproportionate number of its poor are black. And that was retribution from the spirit realm. How? Or further punishment? Many of the poor did not have the money or resources to evacuate the storm. Yes, many of the poor whites also didn't. It headed northeast through Alabama and Mississippi, states where hundreds of African Americans was lynched from the period following Reconstruction to the passage of the Civil Rights Act in the middle 1960s. Hundreds of people were lynched throughout history. It wasn't just blacks, and the notion that it was is sad and small-minded. Yet, when Katrina crashed upon American shores, her wrath was indiscriminate. She brought death, destruction, and suffering to all classes and colors of people. If Hurricane Katrina is seen as an avenging storm of black oppression, the greatest irony will be that blacks are suffering the most. That's why this whole thing doesn't make any fucking sense, but of course you still wrote this entire article. Why? Talk about slavery. Lieutenant General Russell Monroe, who leads the military presence in the Gulf states, affected by the storm, said Hurricane Katrina is a tragedy of biblical proportion. You see, uhuru, y'all. Now, it's all fun and games to me, but it's extremely important to note that there are people out there that believe this shit. This first one I'm pretty certain is just a troll. I'm fairly certain that person doesn't believe any of this and is fucking with them. This second one is an expression of sadness and desperation that frankly is depressing. Almost as depressing as the fact that 19,000 people liked this. And here we have our one and only instance of sanity, where the gentleman cannot find a map that actually matches the two up. One person that agrees with them, but what do we have here? Ah, voila! King Alfred plan reveal. For those of you not intimately familiar like I am, this is the King Alfred plan. Followed by some wishy-washy black Native American hippie shit about permanent landscapes and when you hurt the environment, nature lashes back. So we're gonna skip that, but I would like to quickly scroll to the bottom here and show that even back in 2005, those of the African American persuasion had a strong taste for emojis. And allow me to point out that this is the website where I got that quote from the beginning. But, lest you accuse me of finding only one source, I will reveal to you a second location where I can find someone begging this question. And as she writes here, she is a black fantasy writer. I will from now on call her the black female L. Ron Hubbard. Black female L. Ron Hubbard writes, "Is there a connection between the Atlantic slave trade routes and the path taken by hurricanes? The slave ships from Africa brought a precious cargo, our ancestors. They was transported over the coast of South America and dropped off on various island plantations in the Caribbean, the Gulf of Mexico, and finally, the southeastern coast of the U.S. A hurricane is born in Africa over warm water and follows the same path that our ancestors did. Could the energy source of that storm system be born of those Africans who did not complete the passage? Is the unpredictability of the hurricane a conscious force made by the combined awareness of the lost souls of Africans tossed in the ocean because they were troublesome, sick, dying, or dead? Is the hurricane's electric force and destructive power an emanation from human souls whose bodies were discarded like rubbish in the Atlantic? Sister River, great question. Dr. Ivan van Semeter, as well as Dr. Ben and Clark, talk of the current of the Atlantic coast of West Africa actually flowing naturally towards this hemisphere, which is why a terrible seaman like Columbus wound up in the so-called New World rather than East India, as he proposed to sail. I don't know about the hurricane connection, but surely, if you are relating it to wind currents as it were, then yes, there has to be a correlation. Now, as for the spiritual connection made in the article, I don't want to get into that. It seems if that is so, then our ancestors' wrath has been a bit misdirected, because this thing caused a great deal of suffering. Peace. Would you say that most hurricanes have affected whites? Now, I know this one in New Orleans is hard to accept at this time, but think about the possibilities. I would never wish birth pains and suffering of labor on anyone, but that's where life begins. This is where the possibilities and potential began. She's praising the concept that some black people died in New Orleans, because, well, gotta suffer to be free, I guess. Sister River, now going Taoism on me. Hee hee. Yes. That's a consideration. If it is so, then send us some more, what? Some more of these boys, these bad boys. Okay, so, in fact, send one right through New York City right quick and crush the backbone of their power, as MLK would say. Serious as a heart attack. No smileys can convey what I'm feeling, so scrap that, see? Smileys continued, and this is 2004, so this is pre the other one, Smileys. In seriousness though, I feel ambivalent about such a connection because, like, what the heck took them so long? All these things in their time, I guess. Here we go again, the law of reciprocity. Matt clearly should have known. See, we're talking about, this is a standard belief that gets passed around within this community. Not unusual. Yeah, that's our ill fortune. How can that energy discriminate based on skin color when the energies inside us are as negative and spiritually destitute as the whites who captured them? Energy knows energy. I can understand how it can make someone feel ambivalent. Certainly, we just need to make sure we're standing out of his way when it comes, and the energies we give off is positive. Yeah, that'll save you from a hurricane. Please do that. Just try and get vaguely out of the way, and then just use your energy to block the hurricane. That's neat. But I did want to get to the end of this, where she actually lays it out. Well, the article says that they are restless because the water keeps their bones from drying out. So, short of retrieving those bones and giving them a proper burial, I don't know. I don't understand why a spirit in the astral plane would still be so connected to their previous body and how it's buried. But the places where the most violent acts have been committed are the places where the earth is most subject to natural disaster. Whether it's a hurricane, a tornado, an earthquake. She spelled it quake. Earthquake, okay? Or what have you. In California is where they abuse so many Chinese, and the southern states is where slavery was more rampant and far more subject to violent weather than the north. That's implicitly not true and assumes that more people don't freeze to death every year than die in hurricanes every year. But whatever. They stole the land, and the land itself vomits them out. But we're here too! If more of our people knew what was going on, they stop thinking they got it made in this country and find a more peaceful land. But where? Or how can we find all those bones? Yeah, please, go search the oceans for the bones of Africans. That's a great use of your time. But yeah, that's it. Basically, I was triggered to do this video by Sargon V's little commentary on the hurricane and how environmental racism is trickling back up. And frankly, I've had this on the back burner for about 6 months. So I'm more than happy for any excuse to do it. And that's all for me today, ladies and gents. I hope you enjoyed this reading in multiple voices. I'll be back next week with more content. Stay safe, good luck, and goodbye.